What if the family you trusted most was hiding a terrifying secret? What if the people who seemed perfect on the surface were harboring truths so dark, so twisted, that when they finally came out, they would shake the world to its core? That's exactly what happened with Rob and Michelle Reiner, a couple who seemed to have it all: Hollywood success, wealth, a beautiful home in Brentwood, but whose private lives were far from the idyllic picture everyone believed. But before we continue, please subscribe and turn on the notification bell for updates. The story begins with a question no one wants to answer. Could the tragedy that unfolded have been prevented if the hidden truths had been acknowledged sooner? Rob Reiner, a legendary figure in Hollywood, and his wife Michelle lived their lives in the public eye, known for their charm, their philanthropic efforts, and the success of their family. But behind the velvet curtains of fame, there was a storm brewing, one that no amount of wealth or influence could contain. At first glance, their life seemed flawless. $13.5 million estate, glamorous parties, friendships with the elite. Their children, Nick and Romy, appeared to be thriving in the shadow of their parents' Hollywood stature. Nick, at 32, had his own space in the family guest house, while Romy, at 27, was building her own life. To the world, the Reiners were the perfect American family. But perfection is often just a mask. And in the Reiners' case, that mask hid a truth so disturbing that it would ultimately culminate in an unspeakable tragedy. The shocking revelation is this: Nick Reiner, their son, had a history that was deliberately hidden from the public and, crucially, from the authorities who might have intervened. Rob and Michelle had used their influence to cover it up, and Rob, in one of his final confessions before his death, admitted it was his biggest mistake as a father. At just 17 years old, Nick had been sent to a private psychiatric facility following a violent outburst. The decision to hide this from everyone, friends, neighbors, even the public, was made in the name of protection, privacy, and reputation. But what the Reiners didn't realize is that secrets like this rarely stay buried, and the longer they are hidden, the more explosive they become. Imagine a household where every argument, every incident of violence, was met not with intervention, but with concealment. A teenager struggling with violent tendencies, a father and mother torn between love and fear, and a family caught in a web of secrecy that would ultimately have deadly consequences. How does a family survive when one member's mental health issues are hidden under the weight of wealth and influence? And when do protective measures cross the line into enabling behavior that could have catastrophic results? To understand the gravity of what happened, we need to rewind to the quieter moments before the horror. Rob and Michelle were in their late 70s, 78 and 70, respectively, when their lives ended violently in the very home that had been a symbol of their success and their dreams. They were found stabbed to death in their Brentwood estate on Sunday, December 14th, by their daughter Romy. According to reports, Romy had to confront a nightmarish scene in her own family home, and her testimony to the police included a chilling warning about a dangerous family member who should be considered a suspect. That family member, of course, was Nick. Within hours, he had been arrested and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder, a shocking twist that no one saw coming. The method of their deaths was just as shocking: multiple sharp force injuries, classified by authorities as homicide. The timing of their deaths had been the subject of speculation for days, but the official date of death confirmed what had been feared. The tragedy occurred on that Sunday. And yet, even amid this horror, the underlying story, the one Rob Reiner had tried to confess before his death, remained largely unknown to the public. Rob's confession was not made for headlines or attention. It was an admission of guilt, a reflection on failures as a parent, and a revelation about a mistake that he believed could have altered the trajectory of his son's life. By hiding Nick's institutionalization at 17, by burying the records, by using their Hollywood connections to protect their family's image, Rob and Michelle had set the stage for the unthinkable. It was a decision rooted in love and fear, but the consequences were devastating. Consider the complexity of this situation. A father, a husband, a public figure who had built a career on telling stories, suddenly confronted with the story that mattered most, his own son's story. And realizing that the chapters he tried to write in secrecy were spiraling out of control. The weight of secrecy can crush a family from within, especially when that secret involves mental health, violence, and unchecked impulses. So, why does this story matter now? Because it's not just about a Hollywood family. It's about the danger of hidden truths, about how appearances can deceive, and about how decisions made in the name of protection can sometimes have the opposite effect. It's about a son whose violent tendencies were buried rather than addressed, about a father who admitted his failure too late, and about a daughter left to confront a nightmare that no one could have prepared her for. And perhaps most importantly, it's a story that forces us to ask uncomfortable questions. What responsibility do parents have when a child shows dangerous behavior? How far can privilege go in shielding someone from the consequences of their actions? And when tragedy strikes, how do we reconcile love with accountability, protection with honesty, and secrecy with the truth? The truth about Nick Reiner's past is far more disturbing than anyone imagined. It begins with a teenage outburst that led to institutionalization. It continues with years of concealment and denial, with parents desperate to protect their family image. And it ends with a violent tragedy that could have been foreseen if only the warnings had been taken seriously. By the end of this video, you will understand not just what happened in the Reiner household, but why it matters. You will see how wealth and fame can mask dangers, how secrets can fester until they erupt, and how even the most seemingly perfect families can harbor unimaginable darkness. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. What does a perfect family look like? To the outside world, the Reiners fit the description flawlessly. Rob Reiner, 78, was a Hollywood legend, a director, actor, producer, someone whose name carried weight in every corner of the entertainment industry. Michelle, 70, his wife, was elegant, poised, and deeply involved in philanthropy and social circles. Together, they lived in a sprawling $13.5 million estate in Brentwood, the kind of home people associate with glamour, success, and the dream life. But perfection, as we often learn, is rarely what it seems. On the surface, everything appeared orderly. The garden was meticulously maintained, the interior of the estate a showcase of refined taste, family portraits lining the walls. Neighborhood neighbors would speak of seeing the Reiners hosting parties, attending charity events, or enjoying quiet moments together. Yet behind these images, there were cracks forming, hidden from every camera, every guest, every well-meaning observer. The children, Nick, 32, and Romy, 27, seemed to embody their parents' charm and potential. Nick had the smarts, the looks, the charisma, but beneath that exterior lurked instability that no one outside the family suspected. Romy, the youngest, appeared grounded, ambitious, and loyal, but she was also a silent witness to escalating tensions, to the undercurrents of fear and control that had become the family's unspoken rules. Imagine living in a household where appearances matter more than truth, where a violent outburst or an emotional breakdown is not addressed openly, but quietly swept aside, concealed beneath polite conversation or a veneer of humor. That was life in the Reiner household, a life that would eventually unravel in ways no one could anticipate. Rob and Michelle had built a life on success and reputation, and in many ways, that was their pride and joy. But it was also the cage in which their problems were quietly trapped. The pressures of Hollywood, of social expectations, of maintaining a family image while raising children who were increasingly difficult to manage, created a perfect storm. And Nick was at the center of it all, a young man whose impulses and behavior were becoming more unpredictable, more concerning, and ultimately, more dangerous. From a young age, Nick displayed moments of volatility that were alarming. Friends recall instances of him lashing out in anger, sometimes over minor provocations, sometimes seemingly without reason. Rob and Michelle, like many parents, tried to rationalize, to explain away, to reassure themselves that this was just teenage rebellion or growing pains. But what they saw in private was far more serious than what they presented to the public. The very son they loved was showing signs of deep instability. And they were ill-equipped, emotionally and practically, to address it fully. The family's wealth and status allowed them a level of control over perception that most could only imagine. Nick's behavioral issues, his violent tendencies, could be quietly managed behind closed doors, hidden from the scrutiny of neighbors, schools, and law enforcement. Records could be sealed, explanations could be softened, and appearances could be preserved. Hollywood influence had its advantages, but as history shows, influence cannot erase reality. Meanwhile, Romy was becoming aware of her brother's darker side. She noticed patterns, small inconsistencies, and moments of violence that were disturbing, though at the time, they were easy to dismiss as teenage tantrums. But over time, the evidence of escalating aggression became undeniable. The question the family avoided answering was not whether Nick was troubled. It was how far this trouble would go, and what measures were necessary to prevent disaster. In public, the Reiners remained the epitome of composure. Rob continued his career, attended events, and appeared on television with the same charm that had endeared him to audiences for decades. Michelle maintained her social presence, her philanthropic efforts, and the careful orchestration of a family image that would remain untarnished. But in private, the narrative was entirely different. Arguments were sharp, voices raised, doors closed, and secrets kept. The veneer of perfection required constant maintenance, and every hidden incident added another layer to a fragile facade. The tension between public appearance and private reality is one of the most dangerous spaces a family can occupy. For the Reiners, it was a space that grew over time, widening into a chasm that no amount of wealth or influence could bridge. Their love for Nick was genuine, but their methods of handling his behavior were flawed and in many ways counterproductive. By covering up, by rationalizing, by hiding the truth about his institutionalization at 17, they set a precedent that the family image was more important than confronting the danger head-on. Nick's adolescence, in particular, became a turning point. The first violent outbursts were not minor. They were significant enough to warrant intervention. But intervention in a Hollywood household is never straightforward. When wealth and influence can erase records, when connections can manipulate perception, the line between protection and enabling becomes dangerously thin. Rob and Michelle chose the path of concealment, believing they were safeguarding their family and their son's future. What they didn't realize is that secrets, when left unchecked, do not stay hidden. They accumulate, fester, and eventually erupt in ways no one can control. By the time Nick reached adulthood, the pattern was clear. His behavior had escalated, moving from private incidents to actions that were increasingly difficult to hide. The safety measures the family had relied upon, institutions, private interventions, secrecy, had limitations, and those limitations would soon be exposed in the most devastating way imaginable. But even as these issues grew more serious, the family continued to maintain their public image. Friends and neighbors saw the smiles, the laughter, the apparent harmony. Romy saw more. She noticed the tension in her parents' voices, the avoidance in their eyes, the subtle signs of fear when they spoke about Nick. She began piecing together a picture of her brother's instability that no one else seemed to recognize or acknowledge. It's easy to judge from the outside. It's easy to say that Rob and Michelle should have acted differently, that they should have confronted their son, sought help, or admitted the truth. But consider their perspective: a lifetime of public scrutiny, decades of building a reputation, a son they loved deeply yet feared, and a desire to protect him from a system they believed could do more harm than good. Their decisions were human, flawed, and tragically consequential. And yet, the question remains: at what point does protection become enabler? At what point does secrecy become complicity? The Reiners were not unusual in their desire to shield their child from the world. But in their case, the consequences were magnified by the intersection of wealth, influence, and a family dynamic that had been strained for decades. By the time the fatal night arrived, Sunday, December 14th, the culmination of years of hidden tension, suppressed truths, and unaddressed danger would come crashing down. The perfect Hollywood family was no longer a fantasy. It was a house of cards, waiting for a single moment to collapse. And that collapse would be violent, shocking, and irreversible. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. No parent ever wants to admit their child is dangerous. It's a truth most families avoid facing until the signs are impossible to ignore. But in the Reiner household, those signs were there, quietly escalating, while everyone around them remained blissfully unaware. Behind the manicured lawns and pristine facades, a storm was brewing. Nick Reiner, their son, was beginning to show patterns of behavior that were not only troubling, but alarming. And the worst part? The people who should have acted, the parents who loved him most, were hesitant, paralyzed by fear, guilt, and the shadow of public perception. From early adolescence, Nick displayed what could only be described as volatile tendencies. Friends of the family, distant relatives, and even tutors later recalled incidents that now seemed chilling in hindsight. There were outbursts over trivial things, a missed appointment, a critical comment, a misplaced item, that escalated quickly from verbal anger to physical aggression. Doors were slammed with such force that walls trembled. Objects were broken. Even adults found themselves caught off guard by the intensity of his reactions. And yet, the Reiners had a choice: confront it, seek professional help, or try to conceal it. They chose the latter. Why? Because fear and love often coexist in dangerous ways. Rob and Michelle were caught in a dilemma that many parents can relate to. They wanted to protect their son, preserve the family image, and avoid external scrutiny. Hollywood magnifies every misstep, and the Reiners, aware of how easily rumors could spiral, felt pressure to keep their private lives hidden. In their minds, the solution was discretion, secrecy, and careful control. But secrecy is a double-edged sword, especially when dealing with a child showing early signs of serious psychological distress. The first major incident came when Nick was 14. Reports describe a violent confrontation at a family gathering. Words were exchanged, tensions rose, and what began as a verbal argument escalated into physical aggression. Furniture was overturned, guests were terrified, and the Reiners faced a horrifying realization: their son was capable of uncontrollable violence. But rather than addressing it openly, they decided to manage it quietly. Private counseling sessions were arranged, and the event was never mentioned outside the household. The incident became a whispered memory, a hidden footnote in a family otherwise lauded for its harmony and success. By 16, Nick's behavior had worsened. Teachers at his private school noticed a pattern of explosive reactions, mood swings, and a lack of impulse control. Yet any formal intervention was quietly avoided. Rob and Michelle leveraged their influence, ensuring that school reports remained minimal, that disciplinary measures were discreet, and that nothing ever reached legal or medical authorities. They believed they were protecting Nick and the family from public embarrassment, but in doing so, they allowed dangerous behaviors to continue unchecked. The pivotal turning point came when Nick was 17. A violent outburst occurred that was severe enough to require immediate psychiatric evaluation. This was not a minor tantrum. It was an incident so serious that it could not be ignored. Rob and Michelle made a decision that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They sent Nick to a private psychiatric facility. The goal, ostensibly, was to provide him with the care he needed. The darker, more consequential part of that decision was the cover-up. Using their Hollywood connections, they buried records, shielded the event from authorities, and kept the true nature of Nick's condition hidden from almost everyone. The world would never know, at least not at the time, that the Reiners' teenage son had been institutionalized after a violent episode. For a family under such scrutiny, this decision made a kind of sense. Public revelation could have destroyed careers, relationships, and social standing. But what they didn't account for was the psychological toll on Nick, the family dynamic, and the precedent it set. By hiding the incident, they implicitly sent a message: appearances matter more than consequences. And that lesson, however unintentionally taught, would have devastating effects on Nick's adult behavior. Romy, the younger sibling, began to observe these patterns with increasing concern. Unlike the adults in the household, she was not yet enmeshed in the weight of reputation and social pressure. She noticed Nick's moods, the explosive tendencies, and the moments of sudden violence that left the household shaken. She saw her parents' anxiety, their whispered conversations behind closed doors, their attempts to normalize what was abnormal. And while she was often reassured by her parents that everything was under control, the seeds of doubt were planted. She began to sense that the family's image was being preserved at the cost of confronting an increasingly dangerous reality. During this period, the Reiners also leaned heavily on selective interventions. Nick was enrolled in private therapy, counseling, and even discreet mentorship programs intended to curb violent impulses. Yet these measures, while helpful in some ways, were applied inconsistently. The real-world triggers for his behavior, the pressures, frustrations, and conflicts, were never fully addressed. As a result, the cycle continued. Explosive incidents, temporary containment, and then a return to volatile patterns once the immediate threat seemed diminished. This approach, while intended to protect, was ultimately flawed. Psychological experts emphasize that consistent, transparent intervention is critical in managing violent tendencies, particularly in adolescents showing early signs of severe instability. The Reiner strategy, concealment combined with selective intervention, created a false sense of control. Nick learned that his parents would contain the damage, that consequences were muted, and that his private eruptions, no matter how extreme, could be hidden. It was a dangerous dynamic, one that would shape his adult behavior in ways the family could never anticipate. As Nick transitioned into adulthood, the pattern became more entrenched. Outbursts that might have been manageable at 14 or 16 became more unpredictable, more dangerous, and more damaging. The family's secrecy had effectively insulated him from the accountability that could have altered his trajectory. And while Rob and Michelle continued to grapple with guilt, fear, and hope, they were operating within a framework that made tragedy almost inevitable. The story of Nick's adolescence is a cautionary tale, but it is also deeply human. Parents make decisions based on love, fear, and imperfect judgment. They seek to protect, to shield, and to guide. But when the protective measures involve secrecy, concealment, and avoidance of reality, the results can be catastrophic. The Reiners were not malicious, they were human. And yet, their human choices carried consequences that no wealth, influence, or fame could mitigate. And now, as the narrative moves toward the adult years, toward the night of the murders, we begin to see the full scope of what these early choices meant. The signs of trouble were not only ignored. They were systematically hidden, creating a ticking time bomb that would one day explode. Romy, who had observed more than most, would eventually become the one to discover the aftermath. The violent tendencies, the secrets, the unspoken fears, all of it was about to converge in a way that would shock the world. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. At 17, Nick Reiner vanished from the public eye. Not literally, of course. He was still in the family home, still living in Brentwood, but in every practical sense, he disappeared. The boy who had once been seen at parties, at school events, and in public outings suddenly became a mystery. To the world, he had simply gone off for private treatment. But the truth was far more disturbing. He had been sent to a private psychiatric facility following a violent outburst, an event his parents, Rob and Michelle, went to great lengths to conceal. The first thing to understand is the magnitude of this decision. Institutionalization is rarely a casual choice. It is not something a parent undertakes lightly. The Reiners, despite their influence and resources, were confronting a reality that most people never see in their families. A child whose behavior had escalated to the point of danger, both to himself and to others. Nick's previous incidents had hinted at volatility, but this one was different. The severity was undeniable, the consequences potentially catastrophic. When Rob and Michelle made the decision to send Nick to a private psychiatric facility, they did so with a mix of fear, love, and desperation. They believed that professionals could stabilize him, provide interventions they themselves could not, and keep the situation under control. But at the same time, they were terrified of what it would mean for their family's public image. Hollywood is unforgiving. Careers can be destroyed by scandal. Friends, colleagues, and the press could misconstrue the story, turning their son's mental health struggles into a headline, a punchline, or worse. So they concealed it. They sealed records, leveraged their connections to keep the details out of public and official channels, and made sure the world believed Nick had simply taken time for private therapy. Only the family, and a few trusted professionals, knew the truth. Nick had been institutionalized following a violent incident so severe that it required round-the-clock care. Inside the facility, the situation was intense. Private psychiatric institutions are not hotels. They are places designed to confront extreme behavioral issues head-on. Nick was subjected to intensive therapy, psychiatric evaluations, and structured interventions. He was confronted with the consequences of his actions in ways that his home life had never permitted. Yet, even here, his anger and impulses were a challenge. Staff would later recall moments when he became uncontrollable, moments when the therapy sessions themselves had to be paused for safety. From the outside, however, there was a different narrative. Friends of the family, neighbors, and even extended relatives were given a sanitized version. Nick was getting help, taking time to focus on himself, or dealing with personal challenges. The darker truth, that he had been institutionalized due to violence, was kept hidden. This dual reality created tension within the family. Public narratives of calm and privacy, private experiences filled with fear, uncertainty, and guilt. Rob, in particular, felt the weight of this decision acutely. In interviews and private conversations before his death, he admitted that concealing Nick's institutionalization was his biggest mistake as a father. The irony was inescapable. In trying to protect his son and preserve the family's reputation, he had set in motion a chain of events that he could not control. Michelle shared in this guilt, silently shouldering the burden, hoping that the interventions would work, hoping that the secret would remain just that, a secret. Romy, the younger sibling, was partially aware of the situation, though she did not know the full extent. She noticed the tension in her parents' behavior, the whispered conversations, and the subtle signs that something was seriously wrong with her brother. Yet, like many children in families of influence, she was shielded from the harshest realities, given only enough to understand that her brother was troubled, but not the full truth. This partial awareness created confusion, fear, and a sense of helplessness that would grow over time. The facility itself operated on a strict schedule. Nick was placed in a structured environment designed to challenge destructive behaviors while teaching coping mechanisms. He underwent intensive therapy, including individual counseling, group sessions, and behavioral interventions. The staff worked to understand his triggers, his emotional responses, and the underlying causes of his aggression. But no environment, no matter how well structured, can replace consistent parental engagement and accountability. And that's where the gap existed. While Nick was receiving care, Rob and Michelle continued to navigate their dual roles as parents and public figures. They managed school arrangements, social circles, and business obligations while secretly worrying about the effectiveness of the interventions. Every visit to the facility was fraught with tension. Would the staff be able to reach him? Would he improve, or would the anger and violence continue to fester? And most importantly, what would happen when he returned home? The return home was another delicate operation. Nick was released from the facility under strict conditions, therapy sessions, behavioral monitoring, and a structured schedule designed to prevent regression. For a time, it appeared that progress had been made. Outbursts became less frequent, communication improved, and the family breathed a sigh of relief. But underlying issues remained. The institutionalization had addressed immediate behaviors, but it had not solved the root causes of Nick's instability. And because the family had continued to conceal the events from the outside world, there was no additional support, no accountability outside the household, and no broader system of checks to catch problems before they escalated. This is where the tragedy of secrecy becomes apparent. By hiding the institutionalization, Rob and Michelle prevented the family and the world from recognizing the severity of Nick's condition. Teachers, neighbors, law enforcement, and even distant family members remained in the dark, unaware that a serious intervention had been required. The isolation of knowledge meant that when warning signs reemerged, there were fewer avenues for support, fewer opportunities to intervene, and fewer eyes watching for escalation. Nick's teenage institutionalization was a turning point, both for him and for the family. It was a moment that could have been a foundation for lasting change, had it been followed by transparent support, accountability, and consistent intervention. Instead, it became the first chapter in a long history of concealed behaviors, mismanaged interventions, and mounting tensions. The lessons that could have been learned, the opportunities to address the underlying causes of violence, were overshadowed by the need to protect an image and maintain secrecy. From a psychological perspective, this concealment was catastrophic. Adolescents undergoing institutionalization for violent behavior need consistency, transparency, and a clear connection between actions and consequences. By shielding Nick from public scrutiny and minimizing the incident in private, his parents inadvertently reinforced a pattern in which dangerous behaviors could be hidden rather than addressed. The immediate crisis was resolved, yes, but the underlying trajectory remained unchanged. And yet, despite all of this, Rob and Michelle continued to love their son. Their decision to institutionalize him was motivated by care, concern, and the desire to protect both him and the family. The tragedy lies in the intersection of love and fear, and the ways in which decisions made with the best intentions can have unintended, devastating consequences. Romy, observing these dynamics as she grew older, began to piece together a picture of her brother that was far more alarming than what her parents shared. She saw the moments of rage, the private tensions, and the subtle but persistent signs that the patterns of violence had not disappeared. She began to understand, even if only partially, that the family's public narrative of calm and normalcy was not the whole story. The secret psychiatric facility was meant to contain the storm. For a while, it seemed to succeed. But containment, without transparency or accountability, can only do so much. The seeds of future tragedy had already been planted, and the family would soon confront consequences that no therapy, no discretion, and no concealment could prevent. And what happened after Nick returned home? After the facility, after the interventions, after the carefully orchestrated concealment, would escalate in ways that no one, not even the parents who had tried to protect him, could have anticipated. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Hollywood has always had its shadows. Behind the glitz, the cameras, and the red carpets, influence is currency, and secrets can be currency too. For Rob and Michelle Reiner, their wealth and status in this world offered a certain kind of protection, one that most families could only dream of. But as we're about to see, that protection came with consequences, consequences that would reverberate through every corner of their lives and ultimately lead to tragedy. After Nick's institutionalization at 17, the Reiners faced a dilemma that few parents outside of Hollywood could understand. On one hand, they had a son who required serious intervention, someone whose behavior had escalated to dangerous levels. On the other, they had the public image they had spent decades cultivating. A family seen as charming, philanthropic, successful, and stable. The very fame that gave them privilege also constrained them. Every misstep, every revelation could be exploited by the press, friends, or rivals. The stakes were extraordinary, and the pressure to conceal the truth was immense. Covering up Nick's institutionalization wasn't as simple as saying nothing. In Hollywood, whispers travel quickly, and institutions report serious incidents to multiple parties. Rob and Michelle used their influence to intervene in subtle, strategic ways. They ensured records were sealed, communicated with facility administrators to maintain discretion, and personally reached out to anyone who might inadvertently spread the story. In essence, they built a firewall around their family, a firewall designed to protect, but one that would inadvertently prevent the interventions Nick truly needed. The mechanisms of concealment were both legal and personal. Legally, private psychiatric facilities, especially those serving high-profile families, have ways to keep records confidential, particularly if parents push for it. Rob and Michelle leveraged every option available, from sealing records to influencing reporting protocols. Personally, they controlled the narrative at home, minimizing the incident in family discussions, framing it as a minor crisis that had been handled, and emphasizing Nick's progress rather than the severity of his past behavior. To the outside world, Nick had simply needed a pause, a private moment to focus on himself. But behind closed doors, everyone in the household knew the truth. The incident had been severe, and it had required institutionalization for violent behavior. Hollywood influence extends beyond legal and administrative maneuvering. It seeps into perception, social circles, and reputation management. Rob and Michelle, aware of how gossip can shape careers and friendships, monitored conversations, redirected narratives, and controlled the information flow. Friends, neighbors, and distant relatives were given the official story. Nick was receiving therapy, his behavior had improved, and there was nothing to worry about. Media inquiries were subtly deflected, often with charm and humor. ensuring that no scandal would reach the press. The Reiners were masters of this delicate dance, appearing open, concerned, and loving, while concealing a far darker reality. But this level of influence and control comes at a cost. By insulating Nick from the consequences of his actions, the Reiners unwittingly reinforced dangerous patterns. Violence and instability were temporarily managed, yes, but not corrected. Without accountability, with secrecy shielding him from external scrutiny, Nick learned that his behavior could be hidden, smoothed over, and forgotten. The short-term benefits of discretion masked long-term risk. Romy, growing up amidst this carefully curated reality, began to sense that not everything was as it seemed. She noticed the tension in private conversations, the subtle guilt in her parents' expressions, and the occasional hesitation when discussing Nick. She heard fragments, half-explained events, veiled references to past incidents, and hints of interventions that were never fully detailed. Even as she tried to piece it together, the combination of secrecy, parental authority, and Hollywood influence created a confusing, emotionally charged puzzle. She understood enough to worry, but not enough to intervene effectively. Meanwhile, Nick's behavior continued to evolve. The short-term containment achieved through institutionalization and therapy was effective only in controlled environments. Once back in the household, surrounded by familiarity and enabled by secrecy, he began to test limits in ways both subtle and alarming. Outbursts became more frequent, emotional control more tenuous, and the family's private tension more palpable. The Reiners were caught in a cycle: concealment, intervention, partial improvement, relapse, and renewed secrecy. The tragic irony is clear. The very tools designed to protect Nick, the wealth, the influence, the private facility, also insulated him from consequences that might have redirected his trajectory. In a typical household, escalating violent behavior would likely attract the attention of teachers, law enforcement, and medical professionals. In the Reiners' case, those external checks were muted, diluted, or absent altogether. Privilege had shielded Nick from accountability, even as his underlying instability persisted. Rob, in his later confessions, would reflect on this with deep regret. He acknowledged that the family's ability to manipulate perception, while effective in protecting their public image, had inadvertently enabled destructive behaviors. His words were tinged with guilt. In trying to be the perfect parent, in trying to maintain the perfect family facade, he had failed to fully address the danger within. He had traded short-term protection for long-term risk, and the consequences would be catastrophic. Psychologists and behavioral experts would later analyze this dynamic and note the dangers of enabling through concealment. When violent behavior is hidden rather than confronted, patterns solidify, triggers go unaddressed, and the individual receives implicit lessons that dangerous actions have minimal repercussions. The Reiners, by leveraging their influence to hide Nick's institutionalization, had created an environment in which danger could quietly escalate, a danger that, over time, would manifest in ways no one could anticipate. Even as this private drama unfolded, the Reiners continued to function publicly as a harmonious family. They hosted social events, attended Hollywood gatherings, and maintained the appearance of stability. Friends and acquaintances, unaware of the true situation, marveled at their composure. But the dichotomy between public perfection and private turmoil grew increasingly stark, a tension that would reach its breaking point in the years to come. Romy, by now a young adult, began to internalize the contradictions. She understood that appearances were deceptive, that secrets were powerful, and that family love could coexist with fear and danger. Yet, despite her growing awareness, she remained constrained by the very secrecy her parents had cultivated. She was a witness, partially informed, and increasingly anxious about the undercurrents of violence and instability that surrounded her. The Hollywood influence that had once seemed like a protective shield was, in truth, a double-edged sword. It kept the world at bay, yes, but it also prevented intervention, accountability, and transparency. Privilege, when misapplied in matters of mental health and behavioral control, can be as dangerous as neglect. In the Reiner household, it allowed volatile behavior to persist, escalating the risk for everyone in the family. And as Nick's adult years approached, the consequences of this carefully managed concealment began to manifest more clearly. The structures designed to protect the family image, legal maneuvering, influence, secrecy, were no longer sufficient. Escalating behavior, unresolved anger, and long-buried violence were converging, creating a situation that would explode in ways the family could not control. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Growing up in a household like the Reiners, Romy occupied a delicate and complicated position. She was the youngest child, the observer, the one who saw more than she was ever told. While the public only ever saw the polished veneer of a successful Hollywood family, Romy lived amidst tension, secrecy, and escalating danger. She was, in many ways, the silent witness to a family slowly unraveling from the inside. From a young age, Romy noticed patterns that didn't align with the happy family image. She saw the subtle ways her brother's moods could shift, the sudden flare-ups of anger, the tight-lipped conversations her parents had behind closed doors. Teachers would report minor behavioral issues from Nick, but by the time Romy became old enough to understand the implications, she could see a larger, more alarming pattern emerging. The volatility, the explosive temper, the secrecy. It all pointed to something far more serious than what anyone outside the household could imagine. Romy often found herself caught between innocence and awareness. On the one hand, she wanted to believe in the safety and love of her family. On the other, the warning signs were impossible to ignore. She heard fragments of arguments, glimpsed moments of physical intimidation, and witnessed parental interventions that seemed desperate and secretive. These experiences left her anxious, fearful, and deeply confused. She understood that there was a dangerous undercurrent in her family, but she also knew she had to tread carefully. The first time Romy truly confronted the reality of her brother's instability was during Nick's return from the private psychiatric facility. She had been aware that something serious had occurred, but the full scope of the intervention, the institutionalization, and the severity of his violent outburst remained hidden. Even then, she noticed the tension in her parents' demeanor, the worry that never fully dissipated, the meticulous attention to Nick's behavior, and the constant undercurrent of fear. For Romy, it was becoming clear that the family's public image of perfection was nothing more than a carefully constructed illusion. As Romy grew older, her role as observer intensified. She became hyper-aware of Nick's moods, noting the subtle signs that a temper could flare or that a situation could escalate. She learned to read the unspoken signals her parents gave when trying to contain conflicts, to sense the anxiety in their voices, and to recognize the carefully managed strategies they used to maintain calm. Romy's awareness was not just emotional, it was practical. She knew the stakes, she understood the danger, and she internalized a level of responsibility that no child should ever bear. What made Romy's experience uniquely challenging was the isolation of knowledge. While she had insight into the family's dynamics, she could not speak openly about them. Her parents had instructed discretion, the therapists and staff emphasized confidentiality, and the pressures of growing up in a high-profile family compounded the secrecy. Romy was aware, but powerless in many ways. She saw the warning signs, but she had limited authority or ability to act. Every day, she witnessed patterns of behavior that terrified her, yet she had to remain silent, maintain appearances, and navigate a household fraught with hidden tension. This duality, knowing yet unable to act, shaped Romy's adolescence and early adulthood. She developed a heightened sense of observation, a cautious approach to interactions, and a deep understanding of the fragility of appearances. She watched as Nick's behavior ebbed and flowed, as small incidents were defused by parental intervention, and as the family's wealth and influence smoothed over problems that, in any other context, would have attracted attention. Romy became an expert at reading subtle cues, a clenched fist, a sharp tone, a door closed abruptly. She understood that these signals often indicated a brewing storm. Romy also became aware of the ethical and emotional dilemmas her parents faced. She saw Rob and Michelle struggle with guilt, fear, and love simultaneously. They were committed to protecting Nick, yet they were terrified of the consequences of his actions. Their secrecy, while intended to shield him and the family, created a tension that Romy could not escape. She internalized the pressure, developing both empathy and anxiety, understanding her parents' motivations while recognizing the danger that remained unaddressed. Despite the tension and fear, Romy tried to maintain normalcy. She pursued her education, built friendships, and attempted to live a life separate from the shadows cast by her brother's behavior. Yet, the family secret was always present, an invisible weight that shaped her perceptions, choices, and sense of safety. Every social interaction, every family gathering, was layered with awareness of what might lie beneath the surface. Romy's childhood was therefore one of heightened vigilance, a constant assessment of risk, and a nuanced understanding of family dynamics that few people experience at such a young age. The crucial turning point for Romy, however, came not in her adolescence, but years later, when she would be forced to confront the full magnitude of the danger her family had been concealing. That night, the night of December 14th, Romy's acute awareness of patterns, warning signs, and the behaviors she had observed throughout her life became both a survival mechanism and a source of trauma. She was the one who discovered the aftermath of a tragedy that had been years in the making, the culmination of violence, secrecy, and unaddressed instability. Romy's experience underscores the profound impact of living in a household where appearances are prioritized over reality. She learned to navigate complex emotional landscapes, to assess danger instinctively, and to manage a sense of responsibility that should never have been placed on her shoulders. Her role as a silent witness was shaped by fear, loyalty, and the knowledge that speaking out prematurely could destabilize the very family she loved. In a family like the Reiners, the silent witness is often the only one capable of understanding the full scope of dysfunction. Romy observed, remembered, and internalized patterns that others, friends, extended family, even authorities, never saw. She understood the trajectory of Nick's behavior in ways no one else could. And yet, she was powerless to change the outcomes dictated by years of secrecy and mismanagement. This silent observation created an acute sense of anticipation. Romy, consciously or not, was always prepared for the next incident, the next escalation. She knew the stakes, she understood the volatility, and she recognized the danger in ways most people could not comprehend. Her life had become a constant exercise in vigilance, assessment, and restraint. But even with all her awareness, Romy could not have predicted what was coming. No observation, no intuition, no understanding could have prepared her for the night that would forever alter her life. The night when the family she had silently protected would be destroyed, when the patterns she had observed would culminate in the most horrifying way imaginable. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. Even in the most sheltered households, behavioral patterns cannot remain static forever. For Nick Reiner, the combination of early volatility, institutional intervention, and the family's ongoing secrecy created a pressure cooker environment. By the time he reached his mid-20s, the warning signs that had first appeared in adolescence had not diminished, they had evolved. His behavior escalated, both in frequency and intensity, and the measures that had once contained it were proving insufficient. It began subtly at first. Small outbursts that might have been manageable in childhood became more unpredictable. A minor disagreement could trigger a disproportionate reaction. Nick's temper seemed increasingly untethered, his emotional control fraying at the edges. Friends, neighbors, and even distant relatives who occasionally interacted with him noted glimpses of aggression that were difficult to reconcile with his public persona. He was charming, articulate, and outwardly composed. Yet those who spent more time with him sensed an underlying tension, an unpredictability that hinted at something far darker beneath the surface. At home, the tension was palpable. Rob and Michelle had long since developed strategies to manage his behavior, routines designed to minimize triggers and maintain calm. But even these carefully orchestrated interventions were failing. Nick began testing boundaries in ways that were increasingly concerning. Arguments that once ended with negotiation or containment now ended with yelling, threats, or physical intimidation. Objects were damaged, rooms were trashed, and family members were left shaken. The volatility that had first led to his institutionalization at 17 was not only present, it was intensifying. One particularly telling pattern was Nick's unpredictability. He could be calm, and even charming one moment, then explosively angry the next. This made the household atmosphere one of constant vigilance. Every interaction carried the potential for escalation. Romy, who had grown up observing these patterns, became hyper-aware of the warning signs, learning to anticipate the moments that could trigger an outburst. But anticipation was not prevention. The family was living on the edge of crisis, one misstep away from disaster. Nick's escalating behavior was compounded by the isolation that came from secrecy. Because the family had concealed his past, external checks, teachers, employers, law enforcement had limited insight into his behavioral history. Without public accountability, without consistent external pressure, the patterns of volatility were allowed to persist unchecked. Privilege, which had once seemed protective, was now contributing to the danger. The same influence that had kept Nick's institutionalization hidden had created a bubble in which destructive tendencies could grow. Behavioral experts would later describe this escalation as predictable in hindsight. When violent or unstable behavior is contained but not addressed openly, it often intensifies over time. The individual learns that there are no real-world consequences for their actions, only temporary containment by family or authority figures. In Nick's case, the combination of early institutionalization, secrecy, and intermittent parental intervention created exactly this dynamic. Each episode reinforced his sense that he could act without lasting repercussions, even as tension and fear grew within the household. Several incidents during Nick's adult years illustrate the gravity of the situation. Friends of the family report that he would sometimes lash out over minor frustrations, becoming verbally aggressive, threatening, or even physically intimidating. The escalation was not linear. It came in unpredictable bursts, punctuated by periods of calm that made the next eruption even more shocking. These cycles created a sense of constant instability, a living environment in which every family member had to remain on high alert. Romy, in particular, bore witness to the patterns of escalation. She observed the subtle precursors, the tightening jaw, the sudden sharp tone, the narrowing eyes, that often preceded an outburst. She learned to navigate these volatile moments with extreme care, attempting to de-escalate where possible and protect herself and her parents when not. Over time, this constant vigilance took a toll on her emotional well-being. She was growing up in a household where love and fear were inseparable, where the line between safety and danger was constantly shifting. The escalation of Nick's behavior also affected the family's social and professional life. Rob and Michelle found themselves making excuses for absences, deflecting questions, and carefully controlling who could interact with their son. Invitations were declined, visits were minimized, and conversations were strategically guided to avoid potential triggers. The family's influence allowed them to maintain appearances, but it could not eliminate the underlying volatility. Each escalation added stress, guilt, and fear, creating a cycle that became increasingly difficult to break. Importantly, the escalating behavior was not random. It was symptomatic of unresolved psychological issues that had first appeared in adolescence. Experts later noted that untreated or partially treated violent tendencies, especially when combined with inconsistent accountability and enabling environments, often persist and worsen. Nick's trajectory was a textbook case of this pattern. Early interventions had been made, but the secrecy and insulation meant that long-term management strategies were either insufficient or ineffective. By the late 20s and early 30s, Nick's behavior was at its most dangerous. The combination of unresolved aggression, environmental reinforcement, and social isolation within the family created a scenario in which a catastrophic incident was increasingly likely. The household had become a pressure cooker, with tension building quietly over years, unseen by outsiders, but acutely felt by those living inside. Rob and Michelle, despite their awareness, were unable to regain full control. They continued to love their son, to intervene where possible, and to shield him from consequences, but their tools were limited. They had inadvertently created a system in which volatility could exist in a vacuum, contained yet growing, invisible to external observers, yet deeply threatening to the family itself. And as we approach the events of December 14th, the stakes could not be higher. Years of escalating behavior, unaddressed psychological issues, and secrecy had converged. The household was on the edge of a breaking point, a point where the smallest spark could ignite a catastrophe. But what came next would change everything, and no one saw it coming. December 14th, 2025, began like any other day in the Reiner household, or at least, that's what anyone outside the family would have assumed. To neighbors, it was a quiet Sunday morning in Brentwood, with little indication of the storm that was about to erupt inside the sprawling $13.5 million estate. But for those who lived within its walls, that day was the culmination of years of tension, secrecy, and escalating volatility. A day when the carefully constructed facade of the Reiner family would shatter forever. Morning started quietly, though there were already undercurrents of unease. Nick Reiner, 32, had been acting unusually restless. Reports later suggested that he had been agitated in the hours leading up to the tragedy, pacing, muttering to himself, and displaying the subtle precursors of his unpredictable outbursts. These were familiar patterns to Romy and their parents, Rob and Michelle, who had long since developed a cautious vigilance around him. Every glance, every tone of voice, every movement was monitored carefully. But vigilance, no matter how practiced, cannot always prevent disaster. Rob and Michelle were in the main house, managing their routine but acutely aware of their son's mood. In households like theirs, where past violent behavior had been contained but never fully resolved, every sign of agitation was magnified. They tried to maintain calm, speaking in measured tones, attempting to redirect attention, and subtly guiding Nick through the morning. Yet there was tension beneath the surface, a tension born from decades of escalating behavior, partially addressed interventions, and the family's long history of concealment. Romy, 27, had a sense of foreboding. She had witnessed patterns like this countless times before, a small trigger, followed by escalating agitation, and ultimately a loss of control. Her instincts, honed over years of observation, were screaming that something was dangerously wrong. She moved cautiously, observing her brother from a distance, looking for signs of an impending escalation. But even her acute awareness could not change the trajectory of the day. The initial confrontation, according to later reports and police reconstruction, began in the family guest house where Nick lived. The details remained chilling. An argument escalated quickly, voices rose, and actions became physical. The precise trigger is unclear, but in households with histories of volatility, triggers can be unpredictable. Sometimes minor disagreements ignite disproportionate responses. Witnesses later described a rapid, explosive series of events, each action feeding the next, each attempt at control failing to contain the storm. Rob and Michelle attempted to intervene, but their presence, rather than calming Nick, may have intensified the conflict. In situations like this, patterns of escalation can override reason, especially in individuals with histories of violent outbursts. The intervention strategies that had worked in controlled circumstances were ineffective in the heat of the moment. The family's decades of secrecy and concealment had not prepared them for the reality of an adult son whose volatility had been allowed to escalate unchecked. Romy, upon entering the scene, confronted the horrifying truth. Her instincts, her lifelong vigilance, had prepared her to recognize danger, but nothing could have prepared her for what she saw. The culmination of years of hidden behavioral issues, institutional concealment, and escalating aggression had erupted in a violent, irreversible act. She witnessed her parents' lives end violently, stabbed multiple times, a scene that would forever mark her life with trauma. The immediacy of the tragedy left little room for intervention. The speed and ferocity of Nick's actions overwhelmed the family's attempts to contain him. What had been managed through secrecy, influence, and temporary interventions for years reached a breaking point that no amount of foresight could prevent. The psychological and emotional buildup of decades collided in that single, horrific moment. Police reports later revealed that Nick was arrested that very night and charged with 2 counts of first-degree murder. The chilling reality of the investigation was compounded by Romy's testimony. She identified a dangerous family member, one who had long been a threat, but whose volatility had been concealed, who should be considered a suspect. Her role as a silent witness, honed over years of careful observation, became critical in the law enforcement response. The method of the tragedy, multiple sharp force injuries, underscored the intensity and unpredictability of Nick's violent behavior. The official manner of death was listed as homicide, confirming what Romy and the investigators already feared. The violence was intentional, uncontrolled, and irreversible. What had been a household of hidden instability had transformed into a crime scene, a stark testament to the consequences of years of secrecy, mismanagement, and escalating behavior. The events of December 14th were not merely an isolated incident. They were the tragic culmination of a long history. Nick's behavioral escalation, his teenage institutionalization, the family's cover-ups, and the failure to address underlying psychological issues all converged in that single day. The tragedy was both personal and emblematic. It highlighted the devastating consequences of concealment, the dangers of untreated violent tendencies, and the limits of influence when faced with raw human instability. And yet, even amid the horror, there were questions that lingered. What could have been done differently? Could intervention, transparency, or accountability have prevented the outcome? Or were the forces that led to this tragedy too entrenched, too deeply rooted in years of family patterns and secrecy to ever be reversed? The events of that day marked a turning point, not only in the Reiner family's history, but in the public understanding of the consequences of hidden violence and unaddressed instability.